and we are live on the interwebs. All right, welcome. Thank you for joining us for another Swordsquatch session. Today we're going to be hearing from Matthew Benedict. My name is Shauna. I've been on the Swordsquatch organizing committee for 5 years now. I've participated in all the Swordsquatches, but I was just a volunteer for the first one, and I'm blanking on how many there's been so far. It's been a long week. So we're going to get you guys started here in just a minute. Just a few announcements. The first and foremost is that we are broadcasting from the Duwamish Native lands here in Seattle. Black Lives Matters. Please follow the code of conduct while you're listening to this. We're going to take questions through chat and through Q&A. So please let us know you guys are muted, but our instructor would love to hear from you. So if you have questions, please go ahead and put it in. I think that's it. We're live on Society 6. So if you go to, there should be a post on the on our Facebook page. Go check it out. We have all sorts of the new design for this year is amazing. I cannot wait to get that on merch. So please go check it out. And I think that's all I have right now. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to Matthew.
All right. Hello, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Let's get going on this. So I've got the chat open. The way this talk is going to go, I'm going to talk about honor, which is a real complicated topic. There's a lot of definitions in the first part of this talk. So if you've got like a clarifying question or need some more detail on a finer point, I'm happy to go into that. Drop something in the chat. John is going to be paying attention if you want to raise your hand and ask your question that way. So with those logistical things out of the way, interrupt me if I need to be interrupted. Otherwise, we'll get through the kind of majority of this, and then ideally, people have questions, we'll have a little conversation. So let's talk about honor. And if I can, there we go. All right. Okay, so who am I? I'm Matthew Benedict. I've been practicing HEMA for about almost 6.5 years now. I started at Lonan, moved to Tacoma, and moved over to Grit City. I'm arguably an assistant instructor there. I have an undergrad in history from Seattle University. I studied primarily under Teresa Ehrenfeit, who did a lot of work in queenship. So all of my medieval classes were also cross-listed as what was then called women's studies, but is now called gender studies. And I did a lot of my own kind of focused work in those time periods, kind of early to kind of all over the place, really, mostly Spain and England. But kind of working through those areas, but looking at economics, work, that kind of stuff. Society and culture is kind of a real point of interest to me. So that's kind of where I come at this from. There's my email. I'm happy to talk more about any of this with anybody. Please get in contact. I can send the slides out and all that kind of fun stuff. All right, so before we get into the nitty gritty of what honor is and how it impacts culture, there's a couple of things that I want to point out. So it is pretty difficult to study honor primarily because there's not a lot of academic work on it. There's just a couple of books written in the last 30 years that really look at it. My primary source is this one. It's called Honor by Frank Henderson Stewart. He is a sociologist that looked at it, and this is probably the most academic piece. There's another book called Honor Bound that's more about American, post-industrial American society, which I will get into later. But yeah, so there's not a ton of source material. Most of the writings, if you go looking for books about honor, are written by basically middle-aged white men, which I'm fast approaching, so I apologize for adding to that pool of people. But there are a lot of these like journalists or writers that have basically a non-academic background in terms of history or sociology or something like that. They generally don't make a clear definition of what honor is or how they're defining honor and what it is. They're kind of basically letting their audience assume that they're making an assumption that there's everybody kind of understands what that word means. And then they tend to have, generally speaking, a sense of honor that better fits with kind of modern American society and not really a historical context, which I'll touch on at the end. But basically the last 150 years in the United States, kind of post-industrial, looks a lot different than a lot of pre-industrial societies or a lot of kind of cultures, subcultures that didn't really, I mean, not that they didn't experience industrialization, but industrialization was less for them. And then this gets real complicated real fast because there's a lot of interplay with a lot of other things. All right. So last thing before you get a definition is that I want to make it clear that there are some things that honor is not. And so we'll just get those out of the way. Honor is not a feeling. It's not a thing that you feel. Even though we have this idea, this turn of phrase of a sense of honor, it's not really an emotion or something like that. It's not a gift you give yourself, which is how Liam Neeson defined it in the movie Rob Roy. It's not that. It's not virtue or being virtuous, which will get confusing a little bit. It can include that, but it's not that in and of itself. Your sense of integrity or self-respect, these are all good qualities and maybe necessary to have honor, but they're not the definition of honor. All right, so this is our starting definition. All right, so honor is the right to respect. So I get respect from the people around me. That's gained by adherence to an honor code, and that honor code is created, informed, and enforced by an honor group. Okay, so that's our starting definition of honor, and basically all these little bits and pieces I'll go on to explain. So again, if you need some clarifying, any clarifying points, please drop those in the chat, and I will try and answer those. A couple of things that I want to clear up or talk about kind of as these kind of ancillary tangential things that I think influence or have impacts on honor, but are not the definition or honor itself. So I would argue that the social systems in most of medieval Europe functioned a lot more like a caste system. There was not a lot of fluidity there. And so those kinds of definitions put on people certainly had an impact in the way that honor is viewed, and we'll talk about that. Political versus martial understandings and how people are functioning in society certainly would have affected how honor is realized or plays out in that culture. Religious versus secular, whether that be philosophically, theologically, or just practically, from a sense of there's a large group of religious people versus the kind of martial culture of knighthood, and then kind of aristocracy or nobility versus not people that are not that. Gender certainly plays into this. For the most part, honor is a thing that is applied to groups of people that are presenting as male in a society. Misogyny certainly plays a role in when women start to be more included into honor as a whole in a societal way. That happens more in the early modern and modern period. There's a very narrow definition of that, but is at play and comes in a lot later. Religion in that kind of broad religious sense of the thought processes that exist inside religion, particularly in Christianity. And then, of course, there's going to be geographical differences that you'll see around. But those are, I think the geographical differences are relatively minor, but certainly some of them can be of note. All right, so I would argue that for honor to be present, there are some societal pieces that are kind of around, that are kind of necessary, preemptive, kind of pretext for honor. Economic and resource instability. So if you're unsure of the next harvest, or whether your cattle is going to get stolen, or whether France is going to invade, or really whether France is going to send all excess labor, to you, those are things that are going to weigh on you, and you're going to look for stability. And part of the way that people create stability in earlier societies is through the creation of honor cultures. Generally speaking, the lack of a rule of law as custom. So what I mean by that is not that there isn't law. There is, from Roman times, there is law, but how do people respect that law? Do people trust it? Do people trust that there's a way and a method to enforce it? Strength of property rights and people's adherence to property rights. There are certainly instances in honor cultures where using the law can be dishonorable, that you've got to handle it yourself, which we'll dive into a little bit more. And then this, I think, is probably the fundamental piece of it. In an honor culture, you basically have to have a utilitarian view of people. People have to show their value through their own action and their contribution to society. Not that, medieval society, they just abandoned people who didn't do that, but they certainly weren't then included in honor cultures themselves. So those some bits to kind of mull over as we go through this. And all right, so again, that definition is the right to respect that's gained by the adherence to an honor code, where that code is created, informed, and enforced by an honor group. And then inside of that, there's basically kind of two flavors of honor, horizontal and vertical, that we'll talk about. And then kind of an overarching umbrella, which is how reflexive that honor is. And that's a pretty tricky term, but we'll delve into it a little bit, and hopefully all of this will start to make sense. All right, so what is this code of honor? So the code of honor defines what respect looks like. So a quick example is that, respect looks like not, if you're walking towards another person inside of an alley, you're going to step aside, you're going to be deferential to somebody for whatever reason, opening the doors for people, speaking in a certain tone, or joking with them in certain ways. Those all, whichever ways you can think of, that would feel respectful to me, could all be defined in an honor code. And rarely these are all parts of an oral culture. Rarely these things written down. Arguably, chivalry is a written code, and it certainly exemplifies a lot of pieces of an honor code. I would argue that chivalry is kind of a joke even in the medieval period, but yeah, we digress. All right, so it expresses relevant and high standards. So whatever those standards happen to be. So traits like strength or mastery. So if you're part of a guild, you need to be good at this thing. Carving faces into stone, for example, or you need to be strong enough to, climb a ladder upside down in armor or do a backflip or something like that. Courage, a lot of times honor codes have pieces in them about kind of chastity or sexual rightness. And they make those expectations clear. So there's a way of letting someone know whether they're meeting those expectations or not. And there is, generally speaking, clear repercussions for not meeting those expectations, not meeting the relevant high standards. And basically, honor that cannot be lost isn't honor. So there has to be a way, you have to have something at stake. Otherwise, there's not really a point to having it. All right. So how does this honor code get enforced? So it's shared in an oral culture. It is enforced basically through healthy shame, which can be a sticky kind of way of using that word, but I think it fits here. So encourage someone through pointing out their shortcomings is probably the clearest way. It's always done with a level of support. So it's not valuable, it's not healthy shame if you point out somebody's shortcomings and then don't then provide a way to offer practice or advice or whatever. A member is open to repercussions, kind of the negative sides of that enforcement, if they're not really showing if they show a lack of effort, not really stepping up to do the things that they need to do, just kind of in a general sense, not meeting the standards, or so not everybody gets to be the most elite warrior, so not everybody gets to be in that particular honor culture, and then out and out rejection of that code or individuals in the group, or something like that. And then basically, you could argue that there could be physical repercussions in the sense of opening yourself up to attack or theft or lack of participation in economic opportunities. And then, so you're getting removed from the benefits of that group. You're getting, or you could be removed from the group entirely. That kind of, I think we've all seen examples of, they're just pretending I don't exist in a literal sense. All right, so the honor group, for an honor group to exist, it has to have a couple of preliminary things about it. It must be exclusive. It must be close-knit and intimate. So if you live in an apartment building, for example, and the apartment building decides that everybody is gonna help keep the yard clean around the apartment building, but you don't know any of your neighbors, and all of your neighbors don't really talk to each other. There's no accountability there. So you have to have a system for accountability, which means that you have to have a close-knit or intimate group where people know your business, they know what's going on, and those people have to be willing to enforce those high standards, because without that willingness to enforce the standards, then then things go to chaos, or the system kind of falls apart, and there's not really a reason for having the honor code in the first place. So members, when you join an honor group, so an honor group could be the town you live in, the so honor is an HOA, only kind of. All right. So it could be a town you live in, it could be a guild you're a part of, it could be some form of military grouping, whether however you want to think about that. It could be social clubs. It could be religiously based in later periods. If you're Catholic in a Protestant country, that could be a way that these things are manifest. So members have to understand that when they've met the minimum code, so they have to kind of understand what it is and understand that they've met those commitments. They're committed to upholding the code, as in they're willing to enforce it on other people in the group. They respect and value the opinions and participation of all other members in good standing. There's, generally speaking, a sense of us being honorable or good, and not us despicable or bad or unworthy or untrustworthy, those kinds of things. And you have to have a willingness to step up and defend the group, whatever that ends up looking like. All right, so I'm gonna pause here real quick and see if anybody wants to raise their hand or write a question in there. So now that we've kind of got that big definition chunk out of the way, we've got the other kind of definitional pieces, but I'll pause for just a second to see if anybody wants to raise their hand. I will twiddle my thumbs a little bit. Don't see anybody typing. So I'll kind of go slowly through this. All right, so we've got these honor groups, right? And these honor groups can exist in basically two flavors. You've got horizontal honor, which is a right to respect among an exclusive society of equals. So a guild is a pretty good example of that. Every journeyman in the guild is a certain, has achieved certain goals and or a certain level of proficiency in whatever that guild practices, and so they get to be part of the group. There tends to be very unyielding standards in horizontal, in really strong horizontal honor groups. They have a sense of kind of iron sharpening iron, where you've got a society or a group of people in that society where, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So you've got these people that see it as important that they're always bettering themselves to prove that they are separate and different from those not inside the group. So obviously warriors or military folk have a lot of this horizontal honor going on, skilled trades, and then farmers and ranchers. There are all kinds of stories of medieval Ireland and some from medieval Germany about cattle raids. And so if you don't want somebody to steal your cattle, you need to, it's better to be part of a group and show that there will be repercussions for stealing your cattle than to be the guy on his own that doesn't really have any societal support. All right, and then there's vertical honor. So which again splits into two different types. So we've got horizontal honor must exist for kind of type 1 to exist. And this is really a way of saying that, so sometimes you have a group of people, they're seen as equals, but they need a squadron commander, or they need an elected official. They need someone to represent them in negotiations or something. So office holders, kind of subgroups of special forces in a military context, those are all things that where we see these existences of vertical honor, where someone's been chosen because they have gone above and beyond whatever that means in their particular context, and they're worthy of more praise. And then type 2 vertical honor really starts to come out in the late and early modern period, late medieval, early modern period. It's more defined by class. There gets to be a lot more rules, because the kind of what counts as lack of respect, I feel like gets really extreme. In some cases, this privilege of class gets reflected in law, which is a kind of a paradox of honor cultures, where in the later medieval period, you get more and more of this stuff reflected in law, existing in law, and the law becomes more kind of accepted in those honor cultures, which is just kind of an interesting tangent. But yeah, all right. And then this is kind of an interesting tangent that exists. So if we understand that there is vertical honor that is defined by class, we can start to think of the idea of a thing called house honor, which is in German, this actually gets reflected in law. It starts out as a social custom and then starts to actually show up in law in some interesting ways. So when you're under the protection of someone, someone of a higher status, in our vertical honor scenario, can bestow protection onto someone who is lower status, where the lower status person's actions reflect on on our person of higher status, and that higher class, that person kind of suffers or benefits, at least in part, the consequences of the lower status person. Because so B gets evaluated by their conduct, and A essentially is always getting evaluated on their judgment about support of this lower status person. And because we have these class structures that are really fixed, that doesn't necessarily mean, a king and a peasant, that's struggling to survive. We may be talking about landed aristocracy versus a hedge knight or something like that. There are all kinds of ways where this can get sliced and diced. And then the kind of interesting way that this progresses is you've got this, I'm under the protection of this person. If I'm in their household, I cannot be molested or removed from their household by force. And this gets put into German law as this house honor, this idea of house honor. And it once it's enshrined in law, it actually extends to everyone. And so if you suspect someone of some crime, whether that be, murder or theft or, whatever other, crime you may want to pull somebody out of their house for, it's actually illegal through most of the medieval period, or at least the high and later medieval period, to say, no, you can't do that. You can't just pull somebody out of their house because they have this kind of veil of protection that we have granted to the house itself as a physical thing. All right. So we've got honor, we've got our honor culture, we've got kind of these horizontal and vertical honor structures inside of that. And then over kind of all of this is how reflexive the honor actually is. And I've struggled to find a clear definition for what this means. I'm still working on this point, I think, but this is what I've got right now. So an internal need to provide an extra proportional response, so an overwhelming response to a given threat, mainly with the intention of avoiding future conflict. So basically the don't mess with me principle. If you are strong enough, badass enough, whatever, those are things that you can portray to other people in order to enforce a right to respect. So under a reflexive, the more reflexive an honor culture is, or an individual inside an honor culture is, basically states kind of how, how forcibly you need to respond to what kind of incident or lack of respect. So anything that you view as being a lack of respect, whether that be to the individual, to the honor group, whether that extends to an army or a country or whatever, must be answered. You have to respond to it. That is your call to duty. And it is usually a good way of proving that you are a member in good standing of an honor group, is to say, yeah, I've heard you make that joke or insult me or my people or whatever, my subgroup in such a way, and I must respond to that, whether that be verbally, whether that be physically, whatever. The kind of outside in view of this is that an individual's actions reflects on the group as a whole, and then has this kind of intra group dynamic where, if I don't step up first when somebody makes an off-color joke about my guild, is that I'm gonna lose kind of honor. I'm gonna lose respect that I'm gonna have to gain back. And then honor cultures, a lot of times, because they have to be small and intimate, they have to function in a society in a way that is that's interrelated. You get these kind of, okay, my guild is this honor group, and this other guild is this other honor group, or when we're talking about burghers in late medieval Germany, it could be a neighborhood block where you're all mustering together in preparation for a war or whatever. However those things get defined, it's got an us versus them piece to it. And then generally speaking, and this is kind of the tricky thing, is that generally speaking, value is placed on an individual who chooses the right response to that lack of respect, that insult. So they can prioritize, a lot of different things in their, in their calculus to how to respond to this. And, it obviously has to be extra proportional. It has to be kind of more than would necessarily be expected. It's not a proportional response because it's more than that. But it is, but it has to kind of get prioritized and categorized in the calculus of response, so that you understand how that, whether you're on where you are on that sliding scale. If you murder someone because they made a lighthearted off-color joke, that's probably not going to be seen as a good thing in most cases. Nobody really wants Joe Pesci from Goodfellas in their honor group. They just kind of get stuck with him, and they try and corral him and do the best they can with him. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's the best guy to have around. So if an outsider disrespects the honor, a member of the honor group, if that member of the group does nothing, this opens up not only the individual, but all other members of the honor group to disrespect, which is kind of why the responses have to be kind of extra proportional, because they then need to be something that that shows you that everybody's willing to step up. Yeah. All right. So kind of on the high end of reflexive honor. So any slight or insult, even from a peer, from someone inside the honor group, even if it's really lighthearted, has to have a strong response. I think of like 18th and 19th century European military as kind of reflexive on the really reflexive end of this, where it's like, we have to duel to the death now because what we would consider as modern people to be kind of trifling things. But yeah, it's really timeline dependent on to how this looks like. We'll do some super short case studies and talk about kind of how some of these things play into a timeline. But yeah, more later in time, closer to us on the timeline. The kind of more reflexive most honor cultures tend to be. And then there's this kind of other timeline piece that I think I've kind of beat to death a little bit, but if you don't respond right away, you have to, the response then has to get bigger. And then the way that I tend to think about this reflexiveness is that reflexiveness thrives and becomes more extreme in honor cultures where the thing that that people could comment on or provide or insult you or not provide respect tends to be things that are less kind of objectively provable. And someone's overall societal status is not necessarily the most easy thing to prove in a blink of an eye, which we'll see an example of later. And then there are kind of low and non-reflexive honor cultures that, and these tend to be either really early medieval or kind of some modern honor cultures where honor is given during a test, it's given during competition. It's because of, a guild or kind of craftsman, artist way of thinking about this. If you're an artist and you are part of a collective, you can, you could be part of an honor culture where respect is given and the production of high quality art is seen as being valuable, and arguably it's times like these where things are more provable. You did that thing, and there are witnesses. You produced this thing, and it's it's different than what anybody else has produced. Those kinds of things tend to be low or non-reflexive honor cultures. All right, so why does anybody participate in honor culture? It seems like a lot of work, but there are some clear benefits, and you can tell that I studied a lot of economics because all of these things I realize now are all about kind of economic benefit. But training in whatever context that means, access to jobs, whether that be inclusion in military campaigns or work on the cathedral or whatever, however that works. And then access to capital, access to resources that the honor group has that they are willing to loan or share with other members of their group in order to make the group as a whole better. And then there are things like social supports. If you're a member in good standing for the longest time and you do end up in a position where you do need some support because of age, because of injury, and there is that social support network. There is kind of this matchmaking or kind of societal harmony piece of that, where you meet the right people, you make the right contacts, you marry the right people in order to kind of maintain good quality status in the honor group. And then, a lot of times there are ancillary sounds like I'm dismissing them, but that's not really what that's not the connotation I want, but kind of ancillary people to the members of the honor group. So children, spouses, trainees, people that are not full-fledged members yet, they also get kind of this level of protection or support from the honor group. All right. So things that kind of oppose honor and are relatively they're present through a lot of these a lot of the the medieval early modern time period, but how they're viewed as cultural pieces change over time, and thus sometimes are at odds with honor cultures, the insular aspects of honor cultures. So valuing the rule of law arguably there are ways in which honor or expectations of honor can be included in law, but valuing the rule of law, having a system where the state is strong enough to enforce that law, that there is, you as an individual feel like there is at least a relatively unbiased way of implementing law or implementing punishment for not following law, can be at odds with taking the law into your own hands, or kind of being part of that owner culture. A willingness to adhere to democratic principles. So if it's one person, one vote, whether even in earlier societies, if you're a landowner or a guild member or whatever, obviously that is a larger group of people. It's not universal suffrage, but it is a larger group of people. And so saying everybody gets a say, kind of irrelevant of meeting a wide variety of things present in an honor code, can certainly, if everybody gets a vote, irrelevant of whether they give respect to those around them, can be at odds with honor cultures. And then Christianity and other religious faiths that have ideas around the universality of personal value. So I'm valuable because I'm a person. I am a child of God, and so as a medieval Christian person, God values me. That's kind of the end of the story. Doesn't really work in an honor culture. Arguably, and then there are other things like pacifism, that if you're a pacifist, you can't, unless you're participating in a non-reflexive honor culture, but those are pretty rare. So pacifism obviously is a thing that makes it difficult to participate in honor culture. And then inner intent over outward appearances. So this is a little tangent I'll go on. In kind of post-industrial United States, mainly in the North, there got to be kind of this dramatic shift in the way that honor was understood, in that it was tied a lot more to Christianity. It was tied a lot more to pacifism, and it was tied a lot more to virtue. So if I act rightly, then God knows that I act rightly, and it doesn't matter what anybody else says or what anybody else thinks, because their outward assumption, their kind of outward scorn of me is irrelevant to me possessing honor itself, versus what continued to exist, what existed in the past and what continued to exist in the South that was arguably less industrialized, where you did continue to see these systems of honor culture, and so you do get quite a contrast in what is how is honor is viewed, and that can get real tricky if you're saying, oh well, we should have honor cultures. If we should have honor back, we should have that as an outstanding value. If you have a view that honor is your own internal principles expressed how you best think that they should be, that's very different from somebody who thinks that honor culture, that to have honor, you need an honor group, and you need a code, and you need some way of expressing that honor outwardly. So those are the way that honor is expressed, at least in modern US, obviously changes. All right, I'm gonna pause real quick for a second before we delve into the case studies. Got a couple of case studies. I've got a wrap-up slide, and then that's really it. I kind of blew through these slides a lot faster than I did in practice, which I guess is good, but probably I left out a lot of tangents and explanatory side stories to make sure that we had plenty of time. So if you've got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll dig into some of these case studies, and maybe that will get people thinking and maybe having some questions. All right. Okay, so if we're looking at how honor cultures exist in the early medieval period, honor basically means success in war. That's pretty much it. There's not really a whole lot of talking about honor in a kind of a broader societal context, or whether anyone who wasn't part of the martial culture had any of it. Yeah, and then my fun example, kind of outside of winning accolades in war, is the idea of cattle raids. It's said that the Irish were good mercenaries because they lived in out of doors a lot, tending cattle, and they got really good at sneaking around because they were constantly stealing other people's cattle. And so that's kind of where so early Irish honor cultures probably were a lot more reflexive, even though they don't get written about a ton internally. But yeah, you've got to kind of be seen as the biggest, baddest kid in the neighborhood. Otherwise, somebody's going to come along and steal your cows, and that's no good. A lot of times when honor is talked about in this early period, it's really as objects. So we talk about someone that possesses honor in a way that is for the medieval person very tangible, and it's not really something that's very nebulous. It's you either possess it or you don't. Arguably it's kind of one of those things where it's like you either are chaste or not, and you can be not chaste for a while and have it again, and rededicate yourself to that. But yeah, so but people really do view them as things that can be possessed. And then I have a little story about so there are these jousts. There are these guys in 1326. They set up this joust, and they're basically these three knights and they say, hey, we are going to go to this field. I think I'm pretty sure it's in France. But we're going to go to this field, and we're going to set up a tournament, and we're going to be here for a month, and anybody that wants to show up and test themselves against us, or test themselves about other people, test themselves against anybody else who shows up, like, come do a thing. And so these guys, they set up a thing, and a German knight shows up, and he does something during one of the jousts that is not viewed favorably. And the interesting thing is that the herald that is recording this event, the invitation and who shows up and what happened at the tournament, is just utterly confused about what is going on. He just comments that, like, this knight did something, and the knights that put on the tournament convened a council of knights, and they decided that whatever he did, he was at fault for, and his sentence was to formally apologize to the rest of the knights and to be excluded from the tournament, and he had to go home. And so it's interesting because it's a clear example of, the honor culture existing, that there being a code, that there being a method of enforcement. There are clearly people in good standing. Someone breaks that code, and then there has to be a punishment for it. But those rules and that expression can be utterly bewildering, even to people who were present at the event, which I just found to be an interesting thing. I will also say that tournaments in and of themselves can be a fascinating tangent and side topic about all of the things that do happen at tournaments. Obviously tournaments change their structure over time, which is a fascinating piece in and of itself, but looking at all of the other stuff that's happening at a tournament, all the matchmaking, all the networking, all the kind of training and teaching and that's happening at these things is just kind of mind-boggling. There's tons of yes, and drinking, and lots of drinking. There's a whole lot to be mined, just studying reports of jousts. All right, so we're gonna get into kind of the late medieval period. So honor at the tourney itself. So as we get into the high and late medieval period, the rules about who can participate in tournaments in general, and specifically in the jousts, get a lot more stringent. And so you start to see the influence of kind of narrowing the field in terms of who belongs to this particular honor culture. Let's see. So Thule, or Tusli, I'm going to butcher that name, but get that. The martial ethic in early and modern Germany, she has a section about this. It's really clearly defined, where she starts to talk about how there is a clear cultural shift that happens in the kind of late medieval period, maybe arguably into the early modern period, where some people get into brawls and some people get into duels, and this is a clear class distinction that happens. And so we've got lower class people, maybe even people that merchants or people that belong to guilds, they get into brawls. They get drunk and they fight, and it's uncouth, and there's no real reason for them doing it, just that they are, that they're low class and they don't know any better. But if you're of the upper crust, you get to be in a duel. You get to defend your honor. You're fighting for for a reason, which is just a fascinating way of kind of excluding some people, a way of the upper classes to start to exclude, um, individuals from even acknowledging that they have honor groups or that they can possess honor, um, kind of hoarding, the access to honor, being more and more drawn along class lines. A lot of the understanding of honor cultures and the way that they are, they show up, in society are heavily influenced through romances in general, but particularly in Arthurian romances, because there's lots of knights and they're always doing cool stuff. And so, the Green Knight just came out, and in the original poem, Gawain, does this thing, he lies about having the green sash that protects him from getting cut. And what happens is that not only does he return and tell his story, the result of that is all of the Knights of the Round Table then start wearing green sashes to remind them to not lie, and to be honest and trustworthy. And so there are, so these stories certainly influence, all kind of levels of society, but they're kind of a fun tangent. So, from this slide, basically the two tangents that anybody could go on, it's kind of talking about duels and the structure of duels and how they work, in and of themselves. How are duels and brawls or fights, put in juxtaposition to each other, and then how do people try and live out, the exemplify their heroes that they're reading in literature. All right, and then we get into the early modern period, and this is when reflexive honor is just taken to the max. This is when everything can be an insult, and everything requires, to throw down the gauntlet and get in a fight. And it just gets really extreme. There are just tons of examples, of people in military contexts, feeling as if they were insulted by members of different companies, or their commanding officers, and the lengths they go to kind of exact, to answer that insult, to kind of live out this reflexiveness. There's also a big shift in the intimacy of the honor group. So some honor groups stay small, obviously, but as we start to see this shift from, honor being kind of universally available, and they're starting to be this kind of top down, only the upper crust get to have honor bits. They're also then, if you're in an honor group that is the aristocracy of England or the aristocracy of France, like that's a pretty big group. And bad news travels fast, but not necessarily everybody, is gonna know quite the level, not have the information on an individual quite in the same way that they would in smaller and more intimate groups. And then for any George Silver fans out there, I will talk about this one. So this one from Brescia, Italy in 1589. Um, the the kind of town rolls that's kind of talking about the year in review notes that there has been a significant increase in homicides that year. And it's basically because there are these narrow streets and two guys with wearing swords are coming down the alleyway at each other, and they both believe, because they, for whatever reason, that they should be the one that is that the other guy should move so he can walk past. They both think this at the same time, and because they live in this really reflexive honor culture, they have to respond to this lack of respect. So they end up in a fight, and people end up dead. They end up stabbed through because by this point they're fighting with rapiers. They're fighting with stabby things that are pretty easy to kill each other with. And then I already talked about this post-industrial USA thing. But yeah, so hopefully this was informative. Hopefully it was entertaining in some way. But I'm going to take this one step further and say that, this is valuable to understand when we are in class. So, what we exemplify in the tournament we're going to participate in tomorrow, or people are going to participate in tomorrow, is we use dueling rules in order to come up with our tournament scheme, and I think it's valuable to understand the social context, why someone is going to get in a duel. What does it mean to exist in an honor culture, to have that sense that if I don't answer for this, if I don't put myself physically on the line, this is gonna reflect badly on me. It's gonna reflect badly on my people. It's gonna whoever that is defined, the honor group itself, and I need to step up, because this is my way of not only proving myself, proving my worth to the group, but also protecting my group. Because if I'm willing to do this and show up and fight someone, then maybe the next guy isn't going to insult, my friend, some other guy in the group, and they're going to avoid that conflict entirely. And so not only do I need to show up, but I need to fight well, because this is not only about right now, it's about a future that could be of avoided conflict. So really understanding that motivation and using that as a training tool, when you're going up against an opponent, particularly in a tournament where you're not just facing the people in your club that you train with, that and you want to bring honor to your club. And so what I will say is that, what I'll extend that to is basically saying that, the HEMA community, I think particularly, the HEMA community in the Pacific Northwest, is a non-reflexive honor culture where, we want to bring people in. We're certainly an open honor culture. We're happy to grow the honor culture, but we really do use a lot of, this idea of kind of house protection from someone is, or someone getting vouched for. This is a good guy. This guy is worth listening to. He's a good fighter. He's respectful. Or that person is not respectful. That is somebody I don't want to train with. That is a club I do not want to be a part of. So we have this in and out group. We have a code in that defines what respect looks like. We do have some vertical honor in there of people that have been part of the community for longer, and those that have proven themselves, whether that be through education, teaching others, or showing up and doing well in tournaments, or any of those kinds of things. And I think those are good things that, and we can exist inside the honor culture of the Swordsquatch family, but we can also exist in honor cultures of our own clubs and wanting to bring honor to our own club. And yeah, so that's kind of all I got. While people are formulating their questions, raising their hands, doing all that kind of stuff, I'll do a couple of quick thanks to my wife, Sarah, for proofreading this, because I am a terrible typist and made all kinds of mistakes. So I'm really grateful for her. All my clubmates that listened to this talk more than once and gave me really good feedback. Charles Lynn for doing his social violence class in 2019, and Kaya Sadowski for hosting her and Charles in talks about the cultural aspects of that influence medieval and early modern culture, and really showing me that there's some people out there that are nerdy like me. And of course, the Swordsquatch staff for putting this all together, for doing all the hard work of making these things run and offering me the opportunity to share all of this. So yeah, with that, hopefully there are some questions and we can unmute some people and have a little chat.
Yeah, I'm happy to unmute anybody who wants to raise their hand and sound off. In the meantime, I'm interested. I'd like to hear more about the difference between duels and brawls.
Yeah. Okay. So again, this martial ethic, the martial ethic in early modern Germany, civic duty and the right of arms. It talks about this really extensively, but I'll give you a couple of good examples. So people of all social classes will go to places and drink together. And so you will get, guilds people you'll get guilds people, you'll get aristocracy, you'll get merchants, you'll get kind of this random mix of people. And, and eventually you will get people brawling. You'll get people who get into disagreements or feel as if they have been they've been wronged in some way and they need to answer for it. And as you get into a time when there is actually like a respected rule of law, and there are magistrates that it's kind of a council of magistrates that exists in the city that will adjudicate things. They'll bring people in and you'll have these court records, and you can tell from the court records that if anybody who isn't part of the social class of the council is kind of viewed in a negative light from the start. And so it's like, oh, this altercation happened in a tavern, you were drunk and you had a brawl, and there's not really an excuse for, losing your temper, kind of a thing. But anybody who is of a certain social class kind of gets this benefit of the doubt that, like, oh, they are possessing of honor. And so if they were not properly respected, then of course they had to respond to that, because that's how we keep the social order. And that's where it shows up, is in these law in these law cases, and kind of just the way that they're talked about, really draws a pretty clear distinction about where you would, how it's viewed, at least from the, from that counsel's perspective.
Pretty fascinating. So definitely along a socioeconomic divide.
Definitely. It's pre-Marx, and so that's not how they would have defined it, but certainly how we define it now. It's definitely a social class thing, and I think it really is done because there is, when you're in a mostly agrarian society, it's pretty easy to say, I own the land, I'm in charge. You can have your own honor culture. It doesn't really matter to me because it's really clear who's in charge. But when you start to get into the early modern period and guilds get increasingly more powerful, you've got a merchant class of traders and people moving money and goods around. That line of division about who's the aristocracy and who isn't gets a lot less clear. And I think, the upper classes just, maybe not actively decide, but in a way decide to try and reinforce that difference by saying, we possess honor and you don't. Like, you can't have it. It's not something you can have because we're special. We're different than you. And this is the one way that we can really express that.
I don't know if this is within your realm, but is there a significant difference in European honor cultures versus ones from other parts of the world?
Yes and no. I would say that, we can use the same basic definition to look at honor cultures that exist in areas of which I have very mildly studied, like Japan and China. These honor cultures exist. They follow this kind of broad definition. Of course, then how that is expressed when we talk about having, when we talk about having the I guess what would I say? The way that maybe a middle class Chinese person would talk about honor would certainly be different, and then and that would vary. And I would say that there are writings about honor, whether they be literary or otherwise, about honor cultures that exist that I know of personally in most parts of the world. The only area that I haven't come across anything is sub-Saharan Africa. Not that it doesn't exist there, I haven't found any writings about it. And so I would be curious if anybody knows anything about that, because I'd really like to kind of understand how that manifests. So the way that it manifests in Asia is certainly different. India is certainly different. South America is so colonized. The Americas are so colonized that they tend to reflect more of the, they tend to reflect more European style honor cultures than anything else.
Interesting. My last question, and then I'll let you go, because at this point I'm just picking your brain. Can you give me to what extent were women participating in these honor cultures? I know that I haven't done a lot of historical reading, but I know I've heard of the duels that women were participating in back then. But to what extent did that really extend to female society as well?
So I would say that basically women are not included in honor cultures until the early modern period. I mean, there are maybe some examples that may suggest otherwise in the kind of high or late medieval period. And I guess, yeah, let's just leave it at that for right now. There are caveats and other things that exist to maybe add more context to the earlier parts, but women really start to be viewed more as not just as ancillary individuals of society, but actual participants in society in a different way in the early modern period. And so what you get is this this extension of the honor culture, in that people are sorry, I'm trying to formulate these thoughts. All right, so so women basically are start to be included in the honor culture because they're seen as extensions of in the patriarchal structure or whatever male they're attached to. So, how, in the same way that how I act reflects on my honor group, you can say that, the way that my spouse acts or the way that my children act also have an effect on the honor group, because it says something about the way that we view the kind of influence of the male person. And so that's how we start to draw women in. And then at least in literary sources, they're almost all, I mean, patriarchy, but they're almost always seen as being a detriment to honor. There's a story of a guy who, so he gets married relatively young to a wife who's also relatively young. He goes off to war. His wife has an affair while he's off at war. He comes back. She ends the affair when he comes back, and he finds out about the affair like decades later. And he now he feels like, so then he goes to his buddy and he says, hey, I found this out. And his buddy's like, it was a long time ago. It's not a thing anymore. Like, don't worry about it. But now our protagonist here, he now feels like he has to challenge this guy who his wife had an affair with to a duel, because he feels like if he doesn't do anything, his best friend is going to know that happened and is going to look at him differently, going to look at his wife differently. And so even though literally no one else knows about this affair, he feels like he has to do it, and he does it. And then in the story, he dies in the duel. I think they both die in the duel, but yeah, and it's one of those things where it's like women, in terms of possessing their own honor, comes really late, and it's almost always wrapped up in chastity or sexual rightness. It's really hard to find examples of where that isn't the case. But yeah, that's where we tend to see women. So either reflecting on whatever male they're attached to, and then the sexual rightness is really where you get most of it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that information. It's been really great listening to you. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah. Yeah, if I mean, I'm pretty easy to find on Facebook through the Grit City Facebook page. I'm happy to talk about this with anybody that has any more specific questions. I'm
Excellent.
glad
Thank you.
people enjoyed it. Got
Thank
something
you
out of it.
all for coming. And if you want to see this in person and meet Matthew in person next year, help support us with our by donating if you can, or purchasing swag on Society 6. And come back tomorrow night. We have another presentation by Mike Sherba at 5 p.m. And then a bunch of us will be playing D&D at 7. Thank you, everybody. Thanks
Thanks.
again, Matthew.
You're welcome.
Good night.